All right, hello everyone. Welcome. My name is Katie Salegi. It's a great pleasure to welcome you here today for our most recent distinguished visitor, Avi Gesser. Before we get started, I'd like to acknowledge that the University of Manitoba campuses are located on the original lands of the Anishinaabe, Inanuak, Ansiinanuak, Dakota Aote, Dene, and on the national homeland of the Red River Métis. And you know, as we tell our stories here today, we think about the stories that have been told on these lands since time immemorial. Now, the series that we have, this is part of a bigger project, a collaboration between myself and the Faculty of Law, between Neil MacArthur in the Center for Professional and Applied Ethics, and Christina Penner, who is in the back of the room, who is a senior instructor in computer science. And we've been trying to foster conversations from an interdisciplinary perspective around law, ethics, and technology. We began sort of this lecture series idea last year, and we're really excited to continue it this year with our special guest, Avi. So Avi already spoke yesterday to a group of computer science students focusing on data breaches. It was a really great, fabulous, engaging conversation. And we're going to continue today focusing in more on AI, law, regulation, things that are exciting for law students. So really excited to welcome Avi. Avi leads the artificial intelligence group at the international law firm of Debevoise Plimpton. His practice focuses on advising major companies about a wide range of cybersecurity, privacy, and other artificial intelligence matters. Really exciting time, right, for the adoption of AI by big companies, people trying to work out what their rights are, what their obligations are.
The audio is muted on Zoom.
The audio is muted on Zoom.
We should be better now.
Okay, it should be better now. All right. Is it better now? Okay. Avi currently represents over 60 global services financial firms, private equity firms, insurance companies, hedge funds, and media organizations who are concerned about their AI adoption and regulatory compliance. Another fun fact about Avi is that from 2010 to 2013, he was counsel to the chief of the Criminal Division's fraud section in the United States Department of Justice. And our own unique claim to fame is that he is a graduate of the University of Manitoba with a B.Sc in 1991 and an LL.B in 1994. So here's our Robson Hall alum, made good, and come home to tell us stories of the big city. So we can't wait to hear.
Great, thank you. I was in the same graduating class as Dean Schultz, who finished ahead of me in third year. So, which is
Only barely. I'm only like second and you were third.
that sounds about right. I can't remember who's first and who's second. Well, it doesn't matter now, right? I think, yeah. Anyway, so it's good to be back here. So I spent a ton of time at the University of Manitoba. My father was a professor here, and I spent weekends and holidays here. I was a camper at University. I did a Bachelor of Science degree in chemistry here. I did a law degree here. I worked as a research assistant over the summers here. I then taught the law program at University. So this is, I haven't been back on campus for a long time. It was great to be back yesterday and today and just to walk around and see everybody. So thank you for having me. I'll just maybe very briefly just give you the trajectory of what happened. So I graduated from here, then Dean Schultz and I both went to Cambridge. I came back here, I worked at Thompson Dorfman law firm for a year, then I worked at the Manitoba Law Reform Commission for a year. Then I joined the Canadian Foreign Service briefly. I went to NYU to do a Master's in International Trade, to negotiate trade agreements with the Americans, failed my French exam in the Foreign Service, got kicked out of the Foreign Service for refusing to go back to Ottawa to do a year of language training, and then stayed in New York and worked at a law firm. Was there until 2009, joined the Obama administration in 2009 for the first term, and ended up running the BP Law School investigation for the Justice Department, came back to my law firm, started a cyber program, and then built an artificial intelligence practice at a new firm, which is where I'm at now. So that's sort of how I got here. And in terms of like, what is AI law? It is a whole bunch of different pieces of law: privacy, cybersecurity, anti-discrimination laws, intellectual property laws, all of which get combined to sort of create this new body of law, which is applied to technology. Plus, there are a whole bunch of issues that are entirely unique to artificial intelligence, where we're just making up the laws we go along. And that's not unusual for a new area of technology. For cybersecurity, for about 4 or 5 years, the only guidance that came from the regulators is that you had to have reasonable cybersecurity, which no one knew what that meant. And so, as a practitioner, helping clients who didn't have the luxury of waiting until the regulations came into effect. So the job is to anticipate where things could go wrong, and to the extent things could go wrong, what would you be accused of not doing that you could have done that would have mitigated the risk of the thing that happened. And so for cybersecurity, we spent years thinking about, well, if you were to get hacked and someone were to say, well, are you the bank that got robbed by a super sophisticated group who you basically couldn't defend against, who came in with automatic weapons, or are you the bank who just left the vault open at night because no one remembered to turn it on? And so for cybersecurity, that meant, did you have multi-factor authentication? Did you segment your network? Did you encrypt your data? And over time, you sort of develop all the hallmarks of what it means to take this risk seriously and to protect the data that you've been given by your clients or customers or whoever it is. And slowly the regulations then map that and say, okay, now reasonable cybersecurity means, and then you start to get the statutory law that comes with it. And so for AI, that's the place we're in now, which is there is very little regulatory guidance coming about what is a safe and proper adoption of AI and what is not. And as a practitioner in the area, we are essentially creating the law as we go, and then defending our position and using that in conversation with regulators in regulatory exams, in to the extent something goes wrong in enforcement actions, to say, we're doing exactly what you would expect us to do. We tried really hard. We anticipated these risks, but AI is really tricky, and there'll be mistakes that get made. And to the extent you want to make an example of somebody, we're not the right person to make an example of because we're trying. You should make an example of whoever it is over there who wasn't even trying. And so that's essentially the practice, which is creative. It's really interesting. It draws from a whole bunch of different areas of the law. But it means that you're operating in a space of uncertainty and a space of risk. And it's very easy for the lawyers to say no to everything, right? And we're all good at issue spotting. That's what we learn in law school. It's what we learn, as lawyers. And so if you take any AI use case, and we'll go through a bunch today, all of us can come up with a reason why, oh, I don't like that. That's a privacy issue. That's a confidentiality issue. That's a quality control issue. There's going to be bias risk there. And it's very easy to say no. But all that happens if you say no is the business just goes around. Like that, the upside for a lot of companies of adopting AI is significant enough that they will ignore the legal advice that they think is too conservative. And so that's the risk. And so you want to be creative and constructive and think about how you can get the business who wants to use AI what they need with all the controls and all the guardrails in place to protect customers, data, and so forth. And there's ways to do that, and there is adoption of AI which is not just responsible, but it's better than humans. Just to give you an example. So a resume screening tool can be incredibly risky from an AI point of view. But used properly, a resume screening tool can improve on what is an inherently biased process. Humans are biased and make decisions about hiring subconsciously sometimes consciously, about who they prefer. So if you were to give the exact same resume to a group of people and just change the pronouns and change the name of the person, there are a number of people, professionals, recruiting professionals, who would treat those two resumes differently. The AI can be programmed to never do that. The AI can just be told, ignore pronouns, ignore names, and don't do that. The AI can also screen many, many more resumes than a human can, which means to the extent you're looking for a broad pool of people, it can bring in a much larger and therefore much more diverse talent pool to be reviewed. The AI also can be tuned to the extent you're looking for certain skills, right? Like one of the things that humans are biased at is in hiring is they want somebody who's got the same job title, right? Like we're looking for a computer technician to help us design our websites. And so we were looking for exactly the person who's done that job before for a long time. What the AI is really good at is saying, no, that's not what you're looking for. What you're actually looking for is someone with this skill set and this experience, which they could have got a whole bunch of different ways, one of which was to do this job before. But there are all sorts of other jobs that have almost the exact same skill set. And so really your pool that you should be looking for is much broader. So I'm not like an AI evangelist. There's a lot of AI use cases that I don't think are a good idea. There's a lot of times I don't think AI is the right solution for the problem at all. I think there's a lot of very risky AI use cases. I think overall, from a broader point of view, from a societal point of view, there's tons of risk with AI. I think giving kids access to AI, I think is dangerous. I think in some ways the problems that you have with social media will be exacerbated dramatically by AI, and like artificial friends for kids I think is a terrible idea. But this is not something that's going to go away, and so I think as people think about who is going to help us adjust to a world where instead of decisions are made by humans, that decisions are going to be made by machines or by machines and humans together. Lawyers are going to be incredibly important in sorting out what we want to do and not want to do and what guardrails we want to put in place. Like someone was saying, like, oh, do we have to worry that all the jobs are going to be gone because the lawyers are going to be replaced by AI? And I said, look, if your job as a lawyer is being replaced by AI, your job is kind of crap. Like the AI that would replace you is doing something that you probably shouldn't have been doing in the first place. The way to think about it is, at our core, we as lawyers are helping people resolve disputes and channel their energy in a way that's productive and goes away from, fighting in the streets. Like that's core, right? We are trying to harness the energy that people have to do whatever they want to do in a productive way. And it's taken 1,000 years or more of law to get to a system where people, for the most part, function in the real world with very complicated issues and disputes and do not resort to fighting in the streets over, a typical corporate dispute or a typical human-to-human dispute, for the most part. And we're going to have to recreate that system for decisions that are for disputes. Instead of human-to-human disputes, now we're going to have human-machine disputes and machine-machine disputes, and we're going to have to recreate that whole system of channeling energy and resolving disputes for a new world in which a lot of the disputes are actually not between humans. And so that's an exciting opportunity, and I think it's interesting, and I think I practice what I call AI law, but you will practice law, which is going to have a big AI element to it. Like that's just going to be a fact to it, and there's two pieces to that. There's the how are we as lawyers using artificial intelligence to help us do our job of advising clients. That's one part. And then the other part is how do we as lawyers advise our clients in their use of AI to do it in a way that is responsible. And there's both pieces of that, and they go together. To the extent you are advising your clients on AI and you're not using it yourself, you're not familiar with it, you're not going to be very effective. And to the extent that you are deciding how you use artificial intelligence, but you have no outside world experience on how other people are using it, what works and what doesn't, you're also not going to be very effective. And so I think we're going to live in a world, and this is the world I live in now, and I think for lawyers, a lot of lawyers, this is a world that you're going to live in, I would say, in the next 5 years, where artificial intelligence will be not the primary thing, but will be a part, and probably a fairly important part, of how you deliver services to your clients and how your clients' problems arise in a way that they need your help. So that's the framing. And so what I wanted to do is just go through just some examples, because I think we can talk about this all day long, but it's hard to absorb what I'm really talking about until we just go through a bunch of use cases. So I figured I would just go through a bunch of use cases and see if that's helpful. So I sit as the outside advisor to a number of companies, what they call a generative AI committee. So my firm has a generative AI committee. I chair our firm's generative AI committee. Other companies have the generative AI committee. And that committee, what it does is it's a cross-functional committee. It's made up of someone from legal, from someone tech, someone from risk, someone from the business, often someone from HR, because a lot of the use cases are employment related or hiring or evaluation related. And then anybody else who, maybe some customer service, could be a bunch of different people. And that group gets together and decides which tools we're going to use, which AI are we going to allow people to use, who are the users, who's going to get access to that, what use cases we're going to allow, and under what circumstances, and what data that AI tool is going to be able to have access to in order to do what it's going to do, and then whether we're going to run a pilot program first and see what the results are, or whether we're going to allow it to go right into production, and then what ongoing monitoring we're going to allow. So if we allow the use case to go forward, how are we going to make sure that it's working? And if it wasn't working for some reason, how would we know that, and what would we do to fix it? So let's take a very simple example. So there are, you'll be surprised to learn this, but there are many companies that have lots and lots of policies about what people are allowed to do and not allowed to do, and not everybody at the companies reads the policies and knows what's in the policies. Because there's a lot of them, and it's complicated, people are busy, people don't read policies. So to solve that problem, a lot of companies have decided, well, this will be a good use of AI. And when you think about generative AI, you think generally about sort of ChatGPT or DALL-E or something, and the word generative, right, means that it's generating something. It's generating audio, it's generating video, it's generating text, it's generating images that have never been generated before, and that's what it's doing. For the most part, actual use of AI, generative AI, is more for search and extraction, because one, it's more reliable, and two, that's really what everybody needs. We're drowning in data, and search is not great, and if you could find really what you're looking for efficiently, that would be great. And so a lot of the AI use cases are search related. So here, I'm a company, I'm an employee, I work at a company, I'm going to a conference in Winnipeg, and I want to know, am I allowed to fly business class to that trip and have the company pay for it? So I go onto the company chatbot and I say, am I allowed to fly business class for this trip I'm taking to Winnipeg? And either the chatbot says, chatbot is able to review all the policies and interpret the policies and then provide me the answer and say yes or no. Okay? So that's the use case. Now, why is that a terrible use case? Because you're missing an opportunity to give the company exactly what it needs without the risk. And so let me explain. So there's a couple mistaken assumptions about why that use case might work. The first assumption is that the tool's going to be any good at that, right? Like, you may get good results for a while, but probably not really consistently. And to the extent the tool gives you the wrong answer, that's not going to be helpful, even if it's 1 in 100 times. The other thing is, and that's what we call the capability reliability gap, right? Like, you see AI do something once, you might think, wow, this is incredible, it can do this. But if it can't do it consistently, and for the most part it won't be able to do it consistently, then you have to ask yourself, well, how much reliability do I care about for it to be worth it? So if you're drafting a brief for the Canadian Supreme Court, your tolerance for error is 0. And so even if it's right 999 times out of 1,000, if it makes up even one case or one statute or misquotes something, it's not worth it, and you're never going to be able to check all of that, so you're better off just drafting it from scratch. For this chatbot, maybe you're willing to tolerate some amount of error. But the other thing is, what you don't realize when you're creating a use case like this is people don't interact with the chatbot the way they interact with a human, right? If I call up, I'm sorry, what's your name? Simon. Simon's the head of compliance for my law firm, and I call up Simon, and I'm like, Simon, can I fly first class to Winnipeg for the conference? What's the answer?
No.
No. All right. Thanks, Simon. Okay. But if Simon was a chatbot, right, that's not the end of the conversation, right? I'm like, so Simon, what about if I fly the class above Comfort Plus class to a conference I'm going in the capital of Manitoba?
Maybe.
Right. So I mean, you bang against the chatbot enough, you will, because it's probabilistic, right? Eventually, you will get the answer that you want. And then you screenshot it, and then you fly, and then you submit the receipt and say, that's what Simon said, right? So I don't know what the problem is. So what's the solution? So the solution to that is, instead of having it generate an answer, instead you just have the chatbot pull the relevant section of the policy that gives you the answer, right? Which it can do very well. And so when I ask the chatbot, can I fly business class to Winnipeg, the answer is going to be, here's the relevant section of the policy. And that'll answer your question. And so, I know it seems like a mundane example, but that, at its core, is what we do, what my team does all day, every day, which is just taking use cases and trying to figure out the way to deliver the goal of what people are trying to do by minimizing the risk. And you would think that lots of people would be really good at that, but they're not. In part because it requires a certain amount of creativity that some people just aren't used to applying to this kind of problem. And the solutions are, they can be, you change the use case, you change the user, you change the data, you change the workflow. I mean, there's a lot of different ways to get at this. And it takes practice and time, and a lot of the answers aren't intuitive. Like, you're all very smart, but I could give you a whole bunch of use cases where you're just going to be like, I don't know, because I've never seen it before, and I'm going to seem really smart because I've got the solution, but it's because I've seen this all before, and I've done this before, and once you do, if we went through 100 of these, exactly example like that, by the time we got to the 101, you would be crushing it, because it's not that hard, it's just not intuitive. And so it's a repetition exercise to some extent. So I'll give you a couple more. So so one thing that every company does is they review their employees. You get 10 people who've worked with, sorry to do this to you, Simon, but Simon, and we're evaluating how Simon was as a compliance professional. And we then have to take all those reviews, and I give Simon his annual review, and I tell Simon, look, you're doing great in responding to people, you could get back to them a little quicker, and sometimes you're a little rough on them when they come to you, and you should be, if someone's coming to you, you should be thanking them for coming to you, even if they're done something stupid, because if you're too mean to them, they won't come to you at all, and that's too much risk. So we want you to be nicer to the people, but overall you're doing great. You're going to get your bonus this year, and we're going to give you a bigger office. So, but to take the reviews that you get, 10 reviews, and to synthesize them into a single review that I am going to give that accurately covers all the different reviews is a pain in the ass. It's a kind of thing that takes a lot of time, and AI is great at that. AI is actually really good at synthesizing, at taking those 10 reviews and creating a single set of message points that are I'm able to deliver to Simon. It saves me a ton of time. Okay? And so lots and lots of companies want to use AI for that purpose. Okay? So what would be one of the risks of doing that? Anybody? Simon, what would you be worried about if I were to tell you, Simon, I'm about to give you a review, but just so you know, it was generated by ChatGPT.
I would think it might only look at maybe focus on the effect of your actions and not so much the actual humanistic problems. Like you're being too harsh, but productivity is not focused on.
Okay, so it may lack exterior context, right? So to the extent that it will only know the entire universe of what it sees, and me as a HR professional might want other stuff. So for example, let's say I see a very bad review for Simon, but it's from someone who doesn't even work with Simon, has a bad one interaction with Simon, and is actually kind of a jerk and is really hard on everybody. The machine won't know that, but I will know that. Sorry, do you had an answer?
So say that there's probabilistic, say we'll probably put more emphasis on something that's comes up more often. Say there's something like it's violent and it's maybe it would be kind of concerns like the facts of that.
So and no, I haven't heard, but does it weight in summarizing things that it sees often versus anomalies that it doesn't see? Does it, because it's probabilistic, does it not weight them properly? And that could go either way, right? Because it's seeing something that it hasn't seen before, it could overweight it, could underweight it, it's possible, or it could just be wrong, right? Like if it's probabilistic, it might just actually be wrong. And one of the real concerns about a use case like this is everyone says, oh, human in the loop, right? So I'll just review it. But how am I going to know whether the summaries of 10 or 50 or 20 evaluations is accurate? That's a tough thing for me to validate. Yes?
Well, when a director of human resources, then if they would be subject to the same conditions of advancement that they are purporting to put the members under using artificial intelligence, if they would be okay with that on their own personal advancement possibilities, then perhaps I could see the benefit of it. But if the director of HR is untouched by AI, but wants to give advancement to people below them through AI, is a tad unfair, isn't it?
Well, so, I mean, again, for the people who didn't hear, the question is, I mean, and this happens all the time with AI, which is to the extent that someone's excited to use it, the first question is, would you be excited to use it on you for this purpose? Sometimes the answer is, oh, well, no, not for me. But sometimes, you know what? Sometimes the answer is, yeah, totally fine. And that person could still be wrong, right? Like, just because the director of HR is like, I trust this, I ran a sample test, I ran it 3 times, and it was great, and so I think it's perfect, it saved me a lot of time. That may not be the most effective way to test whether it's working, but it's certainly one of the tools. And so, I'll just cut to the end of this because this hypothetical is going on too long now. But, so this is where you would end up. If people really want to do this, and as a lawyer, say, look, HR is very high risk. This is something you're already doing well. So I don't love AI use cases that are just doing something you're already doing well and just doing it with AI. I kind of want people to be doing use cases of things they're not doing well or not doing at all. And the fact that humans make errors here, you know, it isn't really compelling to me to why you would use AI. But if you really wanted to do this, the way they would do it is you have the reviews come up and there's a timer and people have to read the reviews. That's the first thing. And you cannot see the summary until you click a box saying, I have read every single one of the reviews. And then the summary comes up and you have a timer that gives you 2 minutes to read the summary, 3 minutes to the summary. And then you have a box you have to click that says, I've read the summary, and the summary is an accurate reflection of the underlying reviews, or if it's not, this part is inaccurate or so forth, and that can give feedback to the development team to fix what's wrong. And then, for any real anomaly, anybody who's getting a terrible review, or anybody who's getting a review that's going to, give them a promotion or something, then you've got to go back to the underlying reviews to make that decision. And you have to run a test to see, blind test, have humans do the summaries, have the AI do the summaries, and just have someone grade them, that's how good they are, and see if it's any good, do 20 or 30 of those, and run a sample check of every 100 going forward after that to just make sure it's working. And I would make the pronouns all generic, and I would take out the name and make it pseudonymized and have it just be a number, just in case the underlying tool is somehow favoring by race or gender ethnicity. You want to remove that capability from happening. And I wouldn't do it in Europe. Yes?
Are you open to taking a question from online as well?
Sure.
Folks were asking. So Maria was asking, a key risk of AI decision-making to me seems to be that we have no understanding of how the decision is made. What are the factors considered and how heavily were they weighed in making a determination that, or weighted in making a determination that can have a huge impact on the affected individual? What are potential guardrails in this issue?
Sure. So the question is what we call the explainability question, which is how can you use AI if you don't know how the decision is being made? And so it depends on the use case, right? There are some use cases. So I have a blog. I use AI to generate my cover art for the blog, and I don't care how it works. I don't care at all about bias. I don't care about explainability. I don't care about transparency. I don't care about training. I don't care about anything. The only thing I care about is sort of IP, but I think I'm pretty comfortable that my use for the blog isn't going to be a huge IP infringement risk that someone's going to sue me over. I look at the output. If I say, I'm writing about board oversight. Give me a oil painting in the sort of impressionist style of a corporate board for my website. Now, if I get back a whole bunch of old white dudes, right, then I know it's biased, and I just say, oh, right, sorry, give me a diverse board, and then I get it back. And so for that use case, it doesn't matter. Now, if I'm using it for lending or underwriting or hiring, I kind of want to know what it's looking at. I want to know why it's making decisions. So, good example. So, an AI hiring algorithm will have to pick certain things about why it's deciding someone's a good candidate or not. And so if you just dump all the resumes of the people who work at your company who are very successful and say, find me more people like this, right? It will be like, wow, it looks like being named Jared is really important, and playing lacrosse at Dartmouth is also really important, and so we're going to find more people like that. And so you have to be very careful, because the AI is just picking up patterns, and it doesn't know what patterns are okay or not okay, and you have to tell it what patterns you care about and which patterns you don't care about. And sometimes, if you don't have explainability, then you don't know what patterns it matters. And so this comes up a lot. So insurance underwriting is a very complicated place where it comes up, and insurance is perfect for AI. Huge data sets, lots of statistics and so forth. So if you're deciding for life insurance, right, who you're going to underwrite at what price, having a huge data set and having AI run over it is really helpful. The problem is that the AI will start to look for things that are causal connections, that are correlative connections that aren't causal. So, for example, if you were to feed it credit card data, which you can do for certain kinds of underwriting, and it were to be able to determine what kind of coffee you drink, and I hope this is going to make sense to this group, because this is an American thing, but the difference between Dunkin' Donuts, which I assume there's an equivalent here if you don't have Dunkin' Donuts. Do you have Dunkin' Donuts here? You don't. Okay, there's an equivalent of Dunkin' Donuts. It's whatever is not the Starbucks. So, Tim Hortons. Okay, so I should have prepared this ahead of time. But anyway, okay.
Way too long.
It's going okay on the fly. So the difference between if you drink Dunkin' Donuts, if you drink Tim Hortons versus Starbucks from a risk point of view is quite pronounced. Life insurance, auto insurance, car insurance, people who drink Starbucks are better bets, right? Why? I don't know. Could be the price point, could be where they're located, could be something cultural, but it's probably not the coffee, right? And so you have to ask yourself, what pattern is this picking up, and is it picking up something that we don't want it to pick up because it's a proxy for income or race or gender or ethnicity or something we are not allowed to consider in making this decision, or we don't, as a company, don't want to consider in making this decision. And that comes up in hiring, comes up in lending. So we had a situation with a hiring algorithm that penalized people for having more than a 1-year gap on their resume to the point that they basically weren't going to get an interview. Okay? And, you know, the MIT scientist who came up with it thought they were being very clever, but if you've lived in the real world for a while, you might think to yourself, that's probably going to punish older women who took time off for childcare in a way that's going to be like quite disproportionately, you know, skewing your applicant pool. And if you run the test, that's exactly what happened. And so nobody's trying to discriminate against older women, but if you're not careful in how the algorithm is designed and you're not testing it, you don't have a diverse group of people thinking about these things, then those problems happen. And so that's a very long answer to your question about explainability, but that's where it would matter. Okay, is there another question that I should take, or should, okay, I should keep going. Okay, so, I'll give you, try and give you kind of a different example that shows the diversity of this problem. And one of the issues that I think makes this very complicated for a lot of people, including me, is that when you talk about cybersecurity, you talk about other areas of law, it's kind of like, you kind of know what you're talking about, but with AI, it can be anything, and it can be extremely low risk, and it could be like facial recognition, and it could be like image generation, it could be text generation, it could be so many different things, and so you're really talking about totally different things. And so I'm going to try and give you some examples to demonstrate that. So we have a company that has a culture of their executives making videos to communicate with their customers and with their employees. And the executives make 2 or 3 videos a week in which they just address their customers or address their employees about some issue, what they think about. It's actually a very nice way to build some company cohesion. These are very senior people. It's a huge company. Most people have no interaction with the senior executive at all, and this feels a little personal, and they really like it. Problem is that the executives want those to be perfect. They don't want the video, they don't want food on their face, they don't want to like accidentally touch their nose, they don't want to stumble over their words, right? And so if they make a mistake, to get them back into the studio and to re-record is a huge pain. So now there are AI tools that'll just smooth that over, right? We'll get rid of the crumb, they stumble over their words, they'll smooth it out. If they touch their face, it'll just remove that, and it's totally seamless, okay? So I had a client whose generative AI committee was torn over the question of whether to label that, if it got altered, as AI-generated content. So that's what we call a transparency issue. So as a consumer of that video, I'm not paying for it, but I'm a recipient of it, whether I'm internal or external, do I have a right to know that that video has been altered? Okay? And the committee was torn of it. The privacy folks were like, absolutely, and cybersecurity folks were like, who cares? And so this is the other thing about AI. Whatever your background is, that's the issue you see in AI, and everybody else's issue is not important. So, so what do you think? What do you think? Do you care? Does it matter? It's a tough one, right? Like, I'm not sure, right? So what I said, look, what are you worried about? Which is always a good question to ask, right? Because if you can't articulate what you're worried about, like, what's the worst case scenario here? So someone on the committee said, well, I'm worried that we have investors who watch these videos closely to see the health of our executives. And if somebody's got a tremor or someone looks unhealthy and the AI is fixing that, and we're not disclosing it, then we've got an investor fraud issue. I'm just like, wow, that's awesome. That's some good issue spotting, but that's not actually a real risk here. And so I would keep that quiet, because if you say that to the executives, you are off the committee for sure. Like, because that's not the kind of thinking that they're looking for. Like, that's great for like law school exam stuff, like not great for like advising the executives on something they really want to do. So someone else is saying, well, what I'm worried about is what we call mission creep, right? That they're going to first just fix the crumb on their shirt, and then 6 weeks from now, they're just going to be using AI to do the whole thing. I was like, okay, that's a good one. Because if the entire content is generated by AI, then I think you have a different problem, right? Then I do think you have a transparency problem, because if I'm the consumer of this and I think, oh, what a nice thing for the CEO to come say this to me, but it's actually not the CEO, it's an avatar that's been created, then maybe I do feel like I've been misled or defrauded. And so what we ended up doing was saying that there was a 5-second limit on how much editing could go on. And if you exceeded the 5-second limit, then you needed to label it as AI generated. And everyone got very comfortable with that. And that was like, so 15 seconds, it wasn't me, it was someone else on my team who came up with that. And it was like 15 seconds of their time, which like, everyone was like, oh, thank you, because they had been fighting over it for weeks. So again, like, some of the solutions are pretty low tech. One of the big AI problems that we have right now is a deepfake problem, and I talked about this yesterday at the cyber lecture, but you can have all the greatest cybersecurity you want, and you can have the greatest process and protocols, but if you as an employee think your CEO is telling you to do something, you're going to do it, like whatever it is, for the most part, right? And so we have clients who have amazing cybersecurity, but somebody gets a call from the CEO saying, hey, listen, I need to talk to you. Can you get on a Zoom? They get on the Zoom, it's the CEO. I'm like, look, we've got some very secret deal here, and I need you to wire money here, and you got to keep it quiet because we're worried about insider trading, and just thank you for being a great employee. We'll see you later. And then they wire the money, and then they see the CEO later, and they're like, so is everything okay? And the CEO's like, everything okay about what? It's like, the wire money. Like, I don't know what you're talking about. Because it's a real-time video deepfake of the CEO instructing somebody to do something, and it's totally possible to do that now. So how do you defend against that? It's very complicated, because and you would think, okay, well, I'll just call you on your cell phone, right? So the attackers now, the scenario is, I'm calling you on my wife's phone, and the phone's dead, or I'm with my family, and I don't want to use this phone because it's almost out of battery, so I'm using my husband's phone. Like they get really good at figuring out, like, whatever it is, whatever control you're going to put in, they've got some part of the story that accounts for that not being the case. And so, we had a client who's like, okay, so we're going to install as an overlay onto our video transcript tools, our video tools, is going to be a live human detector that's going to look at the blood flow in your face and detect the normal amount of change in pigmentation over time, and then it'll tell if it's an avatar or not. I'm like, that's one way to do it. Or you could have a password. and just say, which is what I have with my assistant. So I get targeted a lot for attacks just because of if you do this, it's funny because, and this is an aside, but the people who are trying to get into the hacking groups, there's like an application process that they have to go through. And one of the things that they put on their resume is if they've hacked somebody who would be considered hard to hack. And so, not just me, but my whole team is on that list. And so we constantly are getting targeted as people, as junior people coming up, or trying to like show their bosses how good they are at what they do. So, so I'm worried about this. So, and I'm worried that people are going to target my assistant. So my assistant knows that if she has any doubt, if anyone's asking her, if I'm asking her to send anything, to tell her anything that seems even remotely weird or confidential, then she has to ask me a question. It could be any question, but the answer is orange. Now the answer isn't actually orange because I'm not going to relieve it to you, but it's something like orange. And this has happened where I've asked her to do something. She says, "Who's the fourth president of the United States?" And I'm like, "Orange." She's like, "Yes." You know. And again, so the solutions don't have to be complicated and technical. They can be quite, and it's better to the extent they're low tech and they're simple. But you know, there's just like a creative element to that. One of the big use cases for AI is customer service chatbots, right? And the reason why that's a good use case is because customer service is really hard. And there's a lot of information. The customer service representatives tend to get stuff wrong occasionally. And if you could create a chatbot, that's endlessly scalable. So instead of having 5,000 customer service representatives, you now have one customer service representative who's available 24/7 and doesn't get tired, doesn't get snippy, and so, right? So people are like, "Oh, that's a great use case." I'm like, maybe. Okay, so let's think about what you would have to be worried about, because it depends on what the customer service person is doing, right? If the customer service person is just telling you, you know, what's in your account and so forth, there are lots of automated tools to do that. You don't need a generative AI chatbot for that. But let's assume that you've run some tests and the customer service representatives, the humans, are 90% effective at giving answers accurately, and the chatbots are 95% accurate, right? And therefore, it must be better. And I'm like, well, depends, right? It depends on the errors, right? All errors aren't the same. The customer service chatbots make different errors than humans. It's like self-driving cars, right? Like human customer service representatives want to be helpful, so they make errors that are in favor of the customer for the most part. The customer service chatbots, because they're trying to adhere to the policies, tend to make errors in favor of the company. So the direction of the errors change. The magnitude of the errors is quite different. I don't know if you've seen the video of the customer service chatbot at the McDonald's drive-thru ordering this person's orders fries, and there's noise in the background, and the customer service says, "Thank you for your order of 1 million fries," and there's like 1 million fries that are starting to come up. So like that's not an error a human would make, but the customer service chatbots do make that error. And so that's like an evaluation problem, right? Like, how do you know if the AI is working, if it's any good? What does success look like in a very complicated dynamic like that, where it's not, you can't just measure error rate like as a strict, you know, math problem. And there's also just like people like talking to humans sometimes, and if you think you're talking to a human but you realize you're not talking to a human, how does that feel from a customer service point of view, and so forth. I'll do one more, and then I think we can probably stop and take questions. So, first drafts of documents is a very common use case, right? I want to draft a policy. I want to draft some kind of document. I have writer's block. I don't want to draft it from scratch. I just want some stuff down on paper, and I want to use it. I'm not a huge fan of this use case, partly because there's a lot of precedents out there, and those precedents are probably going to be a better starting point than having a generative AI tool do it. I think some things that that we do are worth doing, and just because we can do it quicker doesn't necessarily mean that that's the best way to do it. Like, as lawyers, we are not content generators, right? The content that we create is for a purpose, and for the purpose is for advocacy or for whatever it is, and the process of creating those documents is important for our learning, our understanding, mostly because of what I call the graveyard issue, which is there is choice that's made about what we include and what we don't include in the final product. And to the extent you outsource that to something else, you don't see the graveyard. You don't know what the machine considered and didn't include. And it's not that hard to look at a document and determine whether it's accurate. It is very hard to look at a document and determine what's missing. And all the choices that get made, even when you look at something and decide to exclude it, you retain that, and you don't get that benefit from the machine. And there's, in law, I will tell you, and you probably know this yourself, there is serendipity. You just come across something that wasn't what you were looking for, that gives you an idea about something else, that becomes helpful later or causes you to change your course in thinking, and all the process of all the things that you reject, you learn from, and they're valuable in some way. And I think cutting that corner, especially early in your career, is not always the best way to go. So that's my last use case, and then I can take questions. Does that make sense? Yes?
Flowing from what you just said.
Yeah.
Hold on. We're going to talk into the microphone so that we can have it preserved for a time and more.
Excellent. Flowing from your last point, I was just wondering about the use, what your thoughts are on the use of AI in terms of legal education, its place on producing documents, and your thoughts on that as a seasoned practitioner, and the idea of skills training.
Yeah, I mean, look, so I'm of two minds. So first of all, I think to the extent that you are going to be advising clients about AI, I think you have to be able to know what it does and you have to use it. And I think that everyone should, I mean, one reason to use it is because you realize it's not magic and it's actually really hard to get it to do stuff that you really want it to do. And there's lots of people who use it for a short period of time and then realize, like, oh, okay, like I get it and I don't really need this very much. But I think, building on what I was just talking about, I think one thing that people use it for is taking a bunch of ideas that you've got in bullet points, and then turning it into prose, text, right? Refining what you're doing, cleaning up your sentence structure, organizing your thoughts better, and so forth. I'm pretty good at that, but it's taken me 30 years of writing to get to that point. And so for me, doing that I don't feel like I'm losing something. If I were you, I'd be a little worried about that, because it's a mistake to think that your thinking and your writing are separate. Like, if you pull down a bunch of bullet points, that's what your thinking is. If you turn that into a very well-crafted set of prose that's nice and tight and clear, that reflects your thinking. And clear thinking is reflected in clear writing. But clear writing by ChatGPT doesn't necessarily reflect clear thinking. And I think there's a process by which you solidify and clarify your thinking and streamline it and get rid of extraneous ideas and focus in on the simplicity of what you're trying to say, which is an iterative process that comes from multiple drafts. And just skipping over that, I think, not always, but in some cases, I think robs you of a very important process in your learning, which is how to take a whole bunch of ideas that you've got in your head and get them down to something that is the most important part of that to convey to somebody else in a clear way. So And they didn't ask me to say that, just so you know.
So when I talk about this stuff, one of the things I like to talk about is about automation bias or complacency, right? There's this degree to which there's sort of a technological gloss that exists over the outputs of things like generative AI. So when we get an output from ChatGPT, we tend to view those outputs with more authority than we might a human or a junior who produced a draft for us, because we're like, oh, it's automation, right? And there's a bunch of psychological explanations for why that's happening, why we sort of check out and we allow the tech to take the driver's seat. And so I wonder, in your practice, when you're advising companies, when you're interacting with them, are people alive to some of those risks, or are they sort of excited about offloading things to the AI? Do they see that sort of tension developing?
So, yes, and I think it, again, I hate to keep doing this, but it very much depends on the use case, right? So, over-reliance on AI is partly a result of what I said earlier, which is the capability reliability gap, right? You see it do it one thing really well once, and then you just sort of assume it's able to do that consistently, and it's also able to do something like that, right? So the analogy that I use, and maybe this isn't going to work, but I'm going to do it anyway. The analogy that I use is the difference between a wizard and a magician, right? So you see somebody pull a rabbit out of a hat, right? If you think they're a wizard, you'd be like, they could pull a gopher out of the hat, they could pull a mouse out of the hat, they could pull, right? They could pull whatever they want out of the hat. But you see a magician, you know it's a trick, and you know the only thing that's coming out of that hat the next time you see him is a rabbit. And that is a trick that they have worked on a lot, and they've practiced it. And in order to get that rabbit out of the hat, that is the entire trick, right? There is nothing, any even slight change in where the table is, what the person's wearing, where the people are seated, the trick won't work. And you have to think of AI like that. Like, to the extent it works very narrowly for what you do, and I would not assume that just because it does this, it can do this. It is a magician and not a wizard, and I think part of the education that we try and do with our clients is to say, like, why are you so comfortable with this? What is it that you saw about it that made you feel like you could rely on it for this purpose? And how are we going to make sure you're right about that and validate it and test it and ongoing? And there's real issues of drift, right? Which is that the models just don't perform consistently, right? Some change in the underlying architecture, often there's some guardrail that gets put in place, and all of a sudden something that was really good here is not as good, and something that wasn't very good becomes better. They're just very complex systems, and start messing with them, they can do different things. And so, to the extent you're relying on a generative AI model for something that's important to your business, you have to contemplate this idea that you're not going to get consistent results, and therefore, your reliance needs to be constantly tested and validated. And sometimes people don't want to hear that. So
that reliability capability gap is also, I think, militated by reflections of science fiction in the media, right? Ideas about what robots and AI are supposed to do that come to us from all kinds of different stories.
Well, and for sure, and there's anthropomorphization of the capability, right? So to the extent it does something that you can't do, it's like the first time I used ChatGPT ever, just to see what it could do, I had it write Taylor Swift's song about Harry Potter, right? And I mean, it was fantastic, right? It was like The Boy Who Survived and Little Old Me, and it ends with like, I never signed up for this life, I don't want to be a wizard's wife. Like, and I'm just like, it's so good, like I could never do that. But that doesn't mean it's better at me than anything other than that. Right? And I think when you see it do something that you could never do, you start to be like, oh my God, it's smarter than me. So why am I second guessing it? And I think you have to understand, it's just got a different skill set than you, right? Like, a mosquito is smarter than you at a whole bunch of things, but that doesn't mean you're going to rely on it for legal advice, right? So I think that's the way to think about it. It's like an animal that's evolved differently. Sorry, the question?
So we have a couple questions. We also need to write down our attendance. So I've got a sheet going around the room now, just so that we have some names of people who attended this for the
Mostly to
powers that
see
be.
who didn't attend, mostly. Punishment.
Christina.
Thank you. My question is about what trains these large language models that you're relying on and your clients are relying on. Do you have, like, clients who are mad that a group of artists are coming after them because they used their copyrighted material to train the AI? And I guess that gets to questions of like fair dealing and fair use and possibly to bias.
Sure. So, I mean, first of all, we are on, my firm is on both sides of a lot of these issues, including the copyright issue. So we represent a number of companies who are content creators, education companies, entertainment companies, and so forth. And we represent companies who use large language models, and we represent companies who create large language models. And these are all very complicated issues. I think to simplify what is a very complicated issue, you should just assume that like the entire world of text in the English language that is available in some way has been used to train a model, right? That one of the reasons why, I don't know if you've been following this, but one of the reasons why the capability of the models are starting to, like, the curve is starting to decline and they're not getting as better as they had is because they're just out of content. There just isn't more content for them to train on. So it's literally almost everything now, which includes privacy information, includes copyright information, includes a whole bunch of stuff. Why does that matter? Well, to the extent that you can adverse prompt the model and extract data out of it, right, then you could see stuff that it's been trained on and maybe there's stuff in there that's very personal. Now, a lot of the companies will say, well, it wasn't personal, it was available to us. But the scraping and the way it works, my guess is that's not 100% true. My guess is there's going to be stuff in there that really wasn't public and probably people would be upset if it got out. Now, the companies are very aggressively trying to make sure that you can't extract any particular information by prompting, and people are getting better at that, and that's sort of an arms race. The second issue, which is like I'm an artist and I make my money by painting a certain kind of painting in a certain kind of style, and people pay me for that, and if my works was used to train ChatGPT or DALL-E or Midjourney or one of the tools, and then those tools can be used to say, give me a painting in the style of Avi Gesser doing this, and that dramatically increases the likelihood that I will lose potential customers, and that hurts me economically, and I wasn't given the right, I didn't give my rights away to use that, and I'm not authorizing that, and that's so clearly infringing on my IP that I feel like that's upsetting, and that's going to work its way through the courts, right? I think the argument from the large language model providers would be like, I could see it, I could see that stuff, and I could then copy it. And if you thought that the final product was infringement based on me seeing your stuff and copying it, you could sue me. But the model isn't doing anything other than what every human has done since the dawn of time, which is nobody's inventing anything. Everybody's building on everyone else's stuff, and we're constantly iterating. And if we want to move forward, we can't get stuck and worried about stuff like this. That's what they'll say. And you can decide for yourself which is more persuasive. But I'm not comfortable. I'm not confident that the courts are going to resolve this in a way that's going to make sense from a. This is one of those issues that like the abdication of part of the legislature to come up with a solution that's for the good of everybody creates real problems, because the existing copyright law was not designed for this purpose, and the judges are limited by what the copyright law is. They're not able to make new law, really, although they'll try. But this is a very complicated societal question that I'm not going to resolve. Right? It's going to have to be at the legislature, and we'll see what the new administration looks like in terms of their ability to tackle issues like this. Yes.
Yeah, I want to go back to a couple of the things you said near the beginning of your talk. First of all, I appreciate that you mentioned that when we talk about AI, it's not necessarily just generative AI. There's facial recognition, which was a big thing even a decade or two ago, and the whole field of AI actually goes back to the 1940s. So there's been a whole bunch of other developments between now and then.
I remember that.
Yeah. And the second thing you mentioned was that lawyers are basically creating new law, new rules to deal with AI. So my question then is, have any of these? I mean, I suppose this is not a new thing, that developing new rules. There must have been regulations, statutes, case law, whatever, even in decades past. Have any of these withstood the test of time? Are they still relevant today, or are we doomed, or are lawyers doomed to be constantly reinventing the wheel?
So there are a whole bunch of laws that are surprisingly effective at curbing some of the risk associated with AI. So just basic fraud laws, right? To the extent that you say your AI can do something and it can't do something, or you say you're using AI and you're not, or you say a human's doing something and AI is doing it. You don't need new law for that. All the securities fraud for investors and the consumer fraud, that stuff works, and to the extent there's been enforcement actions related to AI in the United States, most of them, the SEC, the FTC, have just dusted off their existing rules, and they've been able to deal with that. IP is different because this is really quite a new thing. It's just the intellectual property laws are just not designed for this, and it's really not going to hold up very well. The place where you see a lot of innovation from the part of the regulators is not on the actual substance of the law, but on the burden issue. Because if I'm an insurance company and I'm using AI to decide who I'm going to let have insurance, or I'm a bank and I'm deciding who I'm going to loan to, and I've got a very complicated algorithm that includes zip code as being one of the factors that I'm going to consider in whether someone's a good bet or not to lend, because people in the zip code tend not to pay back their loans. And so that's a fairly important factor. You as a consumer, you just no visibility into that whatsoever. And to have the burden be on you to be able to see that and sue for discrimination or whatever it is just doesn't work. And so what you see a lot of the regulation is it's just shifting the burden, saying if you're going to use AI in these circumstances, hiring, lending, insurance underwriting, you are going to have to affirmatively prove that your algorithm or your model isn't discriminatory, because just from a pragmatic point of view, that's the only way we're going to figure this out.
Thanks.
Do you have some other hands?
It's going to be a tough one.
No, it's a really easy one. Last week in torts, we were talking about negligent misrep, and so we took a look at a low-level B.Sc case where somebody relied on chatbot's advice from the airline saying you could get money, a rebate for bereavement fares, right?
Right. So the Air Canada reimbursement case, yeah.
Exactly. And so, what are your thoughts?
Look at this. I know. I'm keeping up on BC law.
You see, this is impressive. Yeah. So it's exactly. It's a civil resolution tribunal. It's not even really technically a court in the way that we think about it, but this is a case Moffat.
Yeah.
So we have a lot of first-year tort law students in this class, and we're just dealing with economic loss, pure economic loss, those kinds of things. So what can you tell them if they're thinking about this? Like, is it reasonable to rely on a chatbot?
So, and this is part of the exercise that we do, which is recognizing there's going to be uncertainty in a place like that. How do you create the certainty that you want, so as a company, you don't want to be in a world where you don't know what the chatbot is going to say to people, and if they rely on it, you don't know what their damage is, and then you don't know whether you're going to be covered for the damage. That's not a place where companies like to operate. So how do we just cabin all that risk and figure it out? So one thing is, you just say that on the website, this is a customer service chatbot, it's for information purposes only. I would not rely on it. And if you rely on it, you're relying on it at your own risk. Or you could do it the other way. You could be like, look, this is the way it's going to go. We're going to own this. We're going to rely on it. And we're going to say, yes, people can rely on it. And if they get bad advice, we're going to actually make them whole. And we're going to get insurance to cover it. And we're going to test our chatbot all the time. And we're going to just make sure that it's not making mistakes, because the only way that we're going to make sure that happens is because we have to own it. And that happens a lot. So it's interesting. So I was asked yesterday about cyber insurance, whether companies have cyber insurance for cyber hacks. And I said most companies do, but a lot of companies don't, because they're worried that if everybody knows they've got cyber insurance, people won't take cybersecurity seriously. And therefore, they won't really do what they need to do to protect their network. And this is sort of that issue as well. Like, if you feel like maybe we won't be on the hook for our chatbot because we put some disclaimer in, or because the courts go one way or another, maybe I won't be incentivized to get it right. And so maybe let's just bite the bullet. If we're going to use it, let's own it. Let's say we're responsible for it. Let's create a line item for losses. And then we're going to hold the tech team accountable for mistakes from a business line point of view, and that will create the right incentives for them to get it right.
So you talked a little bit at the beginning about explainability, transparency, these kind of words that we start to see in some of the AI regulations. And we saw, in the last year, the European AI Act has come into force now. Similar to the GDPR, the Europeans are like the first movers in this space to sort of set up a legislative framework in terms of these are what the expectations that we see vis-a-vis how different AI tools are supposed to be used. How do you see the legal industry responding to that? Do you expect other jurisdictions to follow suit? What's your take?
So one of the problems with regulating AI is it is very difficult for companies to have multiple AI programs. You kind of need, for it to work, and just from an operational point of view, you tend to have one AI program, which means that any regulator anywhere can regulate you globally. So a good example is in New York City, there's a municipal hiring law that says if you use AI for resume screening, you have to do a bias test of the tool, and it has to have these elements to the bias test, which is very prescriptive and complicated and burdensome. And the result was that a lot of our companies stopped using resume screening tools globally because they couldn't hive off their hiring system from New Yorkers. Either for jobs in New York or for people applying from New York, it just was too complicated. And so this is a municipal law that essentially governed globally. And the EUA Act is going to have a similar effect. And so, it's very hard to prevent your AI from reaching Europe. You don't have to have it in Europe. And so, if that's true, then there's going to be a big push for harmonization, right? Because companies don't like onerous regulation. They don't like multiple different versions of onerous regulation. And so if they feel like, we're going to have to be subject to this, then they're going to be like, well, if we're going to be subject to it, I would very much then prefer that everybody else, to the extent they're passing stuff, is doing the same thing, so we've got one standard. And so one theory is we're going to see a ton of wave of regulation, and it's all going to look like a UA Act. The other theory is that, unlike GDPR, the center of gravity of tech has moved so much to the US, and the tech companies are so powerful that they may actually be able to just resist, to just not offer their services in Europe, and to say, we're not doing that, and to look for some alternative regulatory structure that they think is more sensible from their approach, and to try and push that back into Europe. And, you know, I think they feel, and this is being recorded, but I'll just say, some people think that the change of administration is going to be helpful for that. And that some of the support that Silicon Valley had for the Republicans was because they felt that that would be a more favorable regulatory environment for them.
All right, any other questions from the group? All right, oh, yes, we have one. We still have 10 minutes. So I'm happy to take a couple more questions.
I'm not taking it personally that you're walking out on that.
As a law student, I'm more concerned if there's any field of law that we should avoid before we graduate, like after we graduate, because you can foresee that AI is going to be so efficient at automating it. Would you talk to on that point? Would you give us some advice? We should avoid any particular points?
I'm not going to be able to game this properly. I mean, reviewing huge numbers of documents would be not an area I'd get really good at. You know, the machines are going to be pretty good at that. No, what I would tell you is that the one thing that the machines are really good at is pattern recognition, right? And getting really, and they are able to, you know, crunch a huge amount of data. So data extraction is a good example of what the machines are really good at. So if you've got a huge set of documents, like I'll give you examples. We had a data breach. Company had a data breach, and they have to figure out who do they have to notify. And they have 5,000 customers, and each customer has a contract with them for the services that they provide, and each contract has a different clause about when and how and why you have to notify them if their data has been compromised. So I'm the company, I have all my, let's say I'm a law firm, I've got clients' data, thousands of clients' data. Each one of them I have a different agreement with as to why I have to notify them. To go through all of those while I'm dealing with the data breach is not going to happen. But I can run all those contracts through a large language model and have it extract the clauses for those contracts and put them in a table and sort them by which has the highest, shortest time period for notification, so I can triage my notification, right? So that tool is pretty good at that, which is something that, not a great task for a lawyer, but something a lawyer would have done. Now the question is, if that's capable, if that capability exists, now how do I make sure that that works? What are the concerns about that? How do you make that efficient? And can you rely on it? And what are all the guardrails? And so I think in some ways the lawyers are going to be doing sort of higher order tasks, more complicated stuff, and a lot of the mundane work is going to get moved to machines, which is good. But it just means that what you're going to be valued for is sort of the kind of thinking the machines are bad at, right? So creative thinking, thinking that brings sort of a human element to things that are the kinds of issues where, for the evaluation tool, right? It's a perfect example. The machine is just going to take the evaluations and weight them like every human is just a dot, and every review is a dot, and it's all going to be flat. But I know as an HR professional that who's worked with Simon, who's a tough grader, who's not a tough grader, who spent a lot of time with them, whose opinion I value, and I'm going to weight those the way a human would weight them and give Simon the review he deserves. A machine may be quicker, but it may not in the end be better, and knowing sort of when that is the case and when to push back and say, I don't think this is a good use for the machines, or this is a better way to use them, I think is going to be a big, important job for lawyers, and that's exciting, because I think that's good creative work, and you're also, I think, adding a lot of value. So I don't know if that answers your question, but and take evidence. I like my evidence class.
Look, if you were planning to specialize in doc review, I mean, why'd you come to law
Yeah.
school? Let's be honest. All right. Any final questions? Oh, we have one.
So AI is used a lot in for accessibility and reasonable accommodations, and there's been some talk about from the federal letter regulating it and allowing, saying what a company has to provide an individual as AI as in a reasonable accommodation. Like, how do you see that kind of playing out going in the future, like HR to be like, so, you know, Joe got this because he has, you know, accommodations, he gets this artificial intelligence assistance, where, you know, Sally can't. Like,
yeah, so I mean, it obviously depends a lot on what the combination is. I mean, we're starting to see this a lot now. So in resume screening tools, people can opt out of certain, like there are games that people play. This is a Wall Street thing, but like they're for hiring Wall Street traders. There's a game that you play where you just blow up a balloon and you get scored on how much you blow it up before it pops, right? And the higher the score, the better you do, right? And it's designed to assess risk. And there's a whole bunch of kind of games like that. And now there's been a lot of pushback on the fact that some of those games are skewed in a way that certain people with certain kinds of disabilities, they can't score well on, or their scores don't mean anything. And so to the extent that, like, you know, it was not a wave 1 or even a wave 2 consideration, but now as it gets more mature, I think people are really starting to think of, you know, how are these tools used in a way that could be used to benefit people with disabilities, and to the extent we're using them, and we're evaluating people based on their use, how is it being, you know, is it a problem? And you see, so customer service, and I know this is a long way to answer, but now I'm going to segue to something else, which is related though. So customer service people have very tough jobs, and the only people who review them are people who are really angry about it. Nobody stays on the line afterwards and says, I just want you to know that Cindy was great. She was a great customer service representative, and you guys should give her a promotion. Nobody does that. The only people who stay on the line are people who are pissed off. And so it's very hard to evaluate them. So people want to use AI to evaluate customer service representatives. The problem is the AI is like not very good at sorting out what is a good customer service representative call versus a bad one, because it's really complicated. And so, for example, we had a situation where people were getting punished for yelling with their customer service people. If you were yelling at the customer, which sort of makes sense. If you're yelling at the customer, that shouldn't be good. But sometimes the customer is somewhere they can't be heard, or they have a disability. The customer can't, and so you're yelling just to be heard, right? And there's a cultural thing. Like, I mean, I'm a loud talker. There are people who I talk to who we get excited and we start talking to each other and we're sort of yelling. But that's not because we're angry at each other. It's because, and so sort of keeping that in mind as well has become like a lot of the focus, both of the regulators and the companies who are trying to do this right, is to say, okay, now that we've got we understand a little bit of where we're using AI and what works and what doesn't work, let's go back and ask ourselves, could we do better in making this available for people who have disabilities, or not using it in places where it clearly is going to favor folks over other folks in a way we don't want it to do that. So the short answer is, it's a risk, but I think a lot of companies who take this seriously, I think, are looking for ways to use AI to help. And I saw somebody the other day in New York who had like essentially just an iPhone 16 on their chest with a camera facing out and and they were just talking to ChatGPT, and this person clearly had a visual impairment, and ChatGPT was just telling them, it's like, what do you see, and it was just having this long conversation, and it was just helping them guide him through the world, through the camera and through the voice. And it seemed to be very effective, and this did not seem to be like some fit-for-purpose tool. It just looked like they were using the iPhone camera and I guess it was Apple Intelligence through Siri, and there's like, it's pretty cool. Like, that's a pretty powerful use case. So.
All right, well, I think that brings us to the end of our time. I have several takeaway points that I have jotted down on my Domino's napkin. The first is that AI is fast and efficient, but we have to be careful with bias, particularly with proxy data problems. I'm very interested in proxy data problems, right? It's all good you take out the gender and you take out the thing, and then it finds like anyone who was in a sorority or anyone who, what was it, played lacrosse at Dartmouth. Right. So we're on the lookout for these problems.
Any hobbies is probably a bad thing for the AI to.
Gendered hobbies.
Right.
Knitting versus.
Right.
Snowmobiling.
We had someone on our team who were looking at this and said like travel, like on your resume, travel is like such a privileged thing that like you should take it off, which I totally get.
Good point. It's probably pretty cool if you get targeted for a cyber attack. means you're doing something right.
I'll tell you, it's cool for about a week, and then it's just a big, huge bang.
And chatbots are endlessly scalable, but they might accidentally order you 1 million fries. All right, everyone, please join me in thanking Avi for coming.